would you describe the role Tucker Carlson plays on the right now?
I think that he strives to be a person of great influence in directing the policy, staffing, messaging of the Republican Party. And to a certain extent, he is. He has deep ties to people in the administration.
Helped get J.D. Vance named vice president.
Absolutely. And, he's a figure, I would say it is more helpful to interpret him as a politician.
I agree with this.
Yeah. I think that he basically understood the direction of the Republican Party and remade his entire image and self to fit in with it. And he has been very smart about that. And he realized, the old institutions ain't what they used to be. Does it really matter that he's on Fox anymore? Apparently not very much. So his creation of a new persona really is the story of the transformation of the Republican Party.
So at this point, how would you describe what Tucker Carlson's politics are? Like what pole of right-wing ideology does he seem to hew to and represent?
He represents a tradition that's sometimes called isolationist, which views America's entanglement with foreign alliances and interventions in other countries to not necessarily be in our interest. Not necessarily dovish, but definitely the United States should apply force when it wants, when it needs to, in its own very direct self-interest. I believe that he calls himself a Christian. I believe represents a Christian nationalism, which is non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. Again, there are some roots in that and the old right that goes back for the pre-war. He is very hostile to immigration. He seems to have a very strong sense of white ethnic identity and believes that, it's a problem for the country if there are too many non-white immigrants.
Forgive me if I'm misremembering this.
Yeah.
Didn't you do an interview with the son of a Ku Klux Klan member?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you brought that up. So I was working on a piece in 2020 about the conservative movement, and Tucker was a big part of it and his kind of transformation into a right-wing populist. And I got a remarkable quote from someone who was the child of Don Black, a Ku Klux Klan leader and a big figure in the white nationalist movement. The person I got the quote from, just to be clear, left the movement and was highly critical of it. But here's what they told me. From the perspective of my family, Tucker's making the same points they've been trying to make their entire lives, but much better. He's found a wider audience and the ideal method of expression for many of the same ideas. My father's a little baffled still that it's Tucker Carlson, sometimes someone who he always never liked because he saw him as a shill for the Bush administration and the Iraq War, that's bringing white nationalist ideas to the Fox audience. I got this quote. I'm not a very experienced journalist at the time. This is the beginning of my career. I got this quote, and I brought this to my other sources for the story, who are young people on the right. And I thought I had something dispositive. I thought I had something that showed Tucker Carlson's playing around with things that you really shouldn't, that he's moving in a very disturbing direction. They shrugged. They didn't care. And I found that to be shocking and disturbing. And I think that anecdote says a lot.
I also think, and I think this is very important to understanding Tucker and the role he plays, is he understands something Trump understands, but not everybody does, which is the modern right, even more than the modern left, is driven by attention.
Yeah.
Trump has remade it around an attentional economy.
Sure.
And there isn't somebody behind Trump as good at attention as Trump is. J.D. Vance certainly isn't.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be the president to be the leader of MAGA. That it is very plausible to me that you would have a J.D. Vance nomination, but actually the next leader of MAGA is Tucker Carlson. That I think what Tucker Carlson is trying to be is the authentic voice of MAGA, who, because he doesn't have to do all the political coalition work,
right,
he can be purer than someone like J.D. Vance, who I think fundamentally agrees with Carlson at this point.
Yeah.
But has to maintain, or attempt to maintain viability in Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's the thing. I think Carlson views himself in that role for sure. Tucker Carlson was sort of the median, I would say, not conservative Republican to a certain degree. Kind of towed the party line on most issues, Iraq, all this kind of stuff. American foreign policy.
He was on MSNBC.
He was on MSNBC. He was also tried to present himself as a kind of reasonable conservative.
He was like a good time, libertarian rich kid.
Yeah, there's that too. And it's interesting, he takes the bow tie off.
Yeah.
There's a degree that there's costume changes here, He takes the bow tie off. He now has this more folksy look, checked shirts and so on and so forth in this cabin, et cetera, et cetera. He's cultivating an image of himself as down to earth and folksy and not part of the establishment. And it's hard to take when you realize he's the product of it. But there's something important to understand about Tucker Carlson's turn, I think, to anti-Semitism in particular, right? I believe that, anti-Semitism functions as an epoxy for elites that don't really want social changes that would affect their prominence, and in fact want to shore up their prominence, and need mass support, and need a target, and need a story about economic dispossession, a world that doesn't seem to make sense, that serves their interests. You see this in a lot of different places. You see it in Russia. The Tsarist regime kind of invented anti-Semitism for this purpose. The protocols of Elders of Zion are created in this regime that's feeling the pressure of a mass population that's becoming dissatisfied with it, creates anti-Semitism, as a way to rechannel that energy. You see this in France, where you have an aristocracy and a clergy that is kind of pushed into old institutions, sees its prominence in the society losing out. It's sort of losing its world. And then it needs to find a mass politics, a way to attack its enemies. And anti-Semitism becomes very useful for that. So anti-Semitism always works to create a kind of coalition. There's a street gutter crackpot anti-Semitism. And then you have what you could call more respectable anti-Semites. Let's say Charles Lindbergh, right? A person who was highly respected, a respectable person, a great hero to many Americans, but found had a racial view of the world and found anti-Semitic ideas persuasive.
Henry Ford.
So you had these respectable anti-Semites and crackpot anti-Semites, and they're coming together, I would say, is the creation of an actual anti-Semitic politics, right? And this interview between Fuentes and Carlson is this almost textbook. You have the anti-Semitism of the gutter, Fuentes, and you have the anti-Semitism of a declining aristocracy, right? Tucker comes from this preppy background. Father was an ambassador. Stepmother's, Swanson. And, sees an America that's not the way he wants it to be. That's declining, that doesn't look the way he looks like, that has norms that he doesn't share. And you have Fuentes, who comes from, he didn't go to college. He dropped out of college. He comes from a modest background. He is dripping with resentment to a world that he feels doesn't have a place for him.
A self-described proud incel.
Yeah, and also very interesting that he does not try to hide it or pretend that he is not, socially maladjusted in some way, and that lends him authenticity and makes people gravitate towards it. So yeah, that is the most perfect in that interview, in that moment, the most perfect encapsulation of anti-Semitic politics. Declining aristocracy, held down, dissatisfied kind of mob. Bringing them together, and you have a kind of coalition in itself.